First substitute, HB79, Safety Belt Law Amendments, Representative Perry. This bill was heard in Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice with a vote of 7-2.
Representative Perry.
House Bill 79, seatbelt amendments, is exactly what it says. It's amending a current law where we require people to wear seatbelts in their car. Currently, it's a secondary violation. It's one of only 2 secondary violations that we have on our books. I don't think that wearing a seatbelt is anywhere equivalent to not having a front license plate on our car. Therefore, I believe that we need to make wearing a seatbelt a primary or a standard enforcement. Currently, there are 413 traffic laws out there. In a few minutes, we'll have a chance, hopefully, to talk about another bill that I'm asking to repeal 2 of those traffic laws that don't make any sense anymore. But there are traffic laws out there, and if previous legislators to us hadn't passed some of those, who knows what would have happened on our highways. Those are people thinking down the road quite a ways. I want to make sure I reiterate the fact that driving is a privilege. We're required by law to have a driver's license. We're required by law to register our cars. We're required by law not to drive drunk. We're required by law to have insurance on our vehicles. There's many other things that we're required to do. So we need to remember that as we go forward with this, we're dealing with a privilege of driving. There are currently 33 states and 3 territories in the United States that have a primary seatbelt law, and only 16 that have secondary laws in place. Primary states are generally 12% higher. You were all handed a couple of different handouts, a packet of folks that are interested in this, and on those handouts, a couple of things that it pointed out in there is the fact that in a crash, unbuckled passengers can become projectiles and increase the risk of hurting others and killing others in the car by 40%. And then just below it, it talks about average seatbelt use is 12% higher in states with a primary seatbelt law. Then on the back side of the card, it also explains that people who are not wearing seatbelts are 30 times more likely to be ejected from their vehicles. And 3 out of 4 people who are ejected are more likely to die in crashes. And of course, wearing a seatbelt is not just for saving yourself, but it keeps you in good physical control of your vehicle so that you don't end up running into anyone else or injuring anyone else in the process. Also in your handout, the reason I'm running this bill is obviously I've seen my fair share of the outcome when people choose not to wear a seatbelt, when they make that unfaithful choice. And one of the things I've included is a photograph of a pickup truck. And this is my constituent that brought this, asked me to run this bill again this year, and the pickup truck photographs that you look at there from the front and the back involved 2 young people from my area, Tyler and Mandy. They were involved in a rollover crash that came off of Interstate 15 and rolled down onto Interstate 84. I hate to say lucky, but lucky no one else was on Interstate 84 right at that exact moment when the driver lost control of his truck because the driver wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Neither were the 2 occupants in the truck, and in this rollover crash, you look at the truck, you can see it's a survivable crash if they'd had seatbelts on. But Tyler and Mandy were both ejected, and the driver was kept in the vehicle because of his friends, and he has a broken back and is partially paralyzed. One other thing I want to point out in the photograph, besides the fact that that vehicle shows that these young people would have survived, if you look in the background, you'll see the delay. And of course, the lives are the primary reason for bringing this up, but if you look at the delay that's caused by these types of crashes, the delay is great, and we found that we have a huge economic cost to us as a society when we have these types of crashes occur. And on the back of that sheet is actually a summary from Minnesota, who passed a similar law to what we're asking you to pass here. And Minnesota found, after they passed their law and did a study of the years prior to passing this law, up to the point where the law went into effect, that they had resulted indicated that there were 68 fewer deaths, 320 fewer severe injuries, and 432 fewer moderate injuries. And then below that, the impact of the law on the Minnesota's economy indicated that they did a study, and it said it translated into at least $45 million in avoidable hospital charges by passing that, including a direct savings of nearly $10 million or more tax dollars that would have been paid for expenses charged to Medicare, Medicaid, and other government insurers. So we can see the successes that have occurred in other states. As I mentioned, physical control is a major issue here. Again, we've passed other laws about using devices in our car, about following too close, and we've even taken some progressive steps as a legislature to increase the speed limit to make sure that we're where we should be out on our roadways. I think that it's our job as legislators to look for what is good public policy to put out there in front of us. And of course, again, I emphasize that there is a cost to society. What we found is that right now our average in the state of Utah is 83% roughly of the state of Utah on an average seatbelt observation are wearing seatbelts. That means 17% of our population is resulting in 50% of our fatalities. Because of our fatal crashes we're investigating and we're dealing with out there in motor vehicles, 50% of those people who are dying are not wearing seatbelts. So 17% of our population is creating 50% of the problem that's occurring out there. And of course, on the one card from Zero Fatalities, it mentioned year after year the number one contributing factor in fatal crashes is not wearing seatbelts. That's the reason I bring this bill before you today. In the packet, you'll notice there's several groups that have come out. We just didn't know where to stop because we had so many people saying this is good public policy. Utah is known as one of the best ranked states for business, for all the other great things that Utah does. This is another place where Utah can be known as a safe state to operate and travel on our roadways. Obviously, we have the Advocates for Highway Safety, we have the Utah Association of Justice, the Salt Lake Chamber, and numerous other businesses, and including the Utah Transportation Coalition, where they've gone online and recruited over 200 businesses here in Utah that have said, we support this legislation. We think this is good public policy for Utah. And with that, representatives, also one last thing I wanted to point out was our Workers' Compensation Fund also put a flyer in there for you about motor vehicle claims that we're paying out to Workers' Compensation Fund, and the motor vehicle claims are far greater on their flyer, you noticed, than any other claims that they deal with there. Of course, that's an economic side. Just the losing of lives is the critical side to this issue. And with that, I'd ask for your support for this bill and be open to any questions.
Thank you, Representative. Discussion to the bill. Representative Fred Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. Will the sponsor yield to a series of questions?
Will the sponsor yield?
I will.
Proceed.
Thank you. You mentioned approximately 17% are not wearing seatbelts. Do we have an idea on age? Are those older drivers, younger drivers? Do we know?
They are broken down. I don't have it right here in front of me. There are, we have a tendency that there's a group between 16 and 35 seem to be a large contributing factor as far as not wearing seatbelts, but it goes across the range. I know that there's a larger component with that group, though.
The next question ties into that. When I was 16 and I was taking driver's ed, we had the opportunity of basically seeing lots of very gruesome photos of crashes, probably some similar to some of the ones that you have actually seen in person. I was wondering if we still have that policy in Utah, because that obviously over 40 years ago, and I still remember that.
Was there a question?
Yes. Do we still have the policy of showing the gruesome videos to the driver's education?
Red asphalt. I'm not aware of what the driver's ed teachers are currently showing in their classes at this point. I'm aware of what you're talking about. I know in my chosen profession in the Highway Patrol, we do have a tendency sometimes to go out and share with driver's ed classes some videos. I don't know that they're the red asphalt version that we probably saw 20, 30 years ago.
My final, I have one comment, and that is instead of changing the law, perhaps we need to change our education in that area. Thank you.
Further discussion to the bill. Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I rise to speak in support of this bill. Representatives, over the last 3 weeks, I have had a new experience that I have never had before in my life, and that is to sit on the Social Services Appropriations Committee. And while I have sat there, we have heard from people who were disabled begging for relief, for medical supplies, for diapers, for nutrition. We have heard from their families begging for relief. We have heard from those on the waiting list begging to have funding to be off the waiting list. We have heard from people with traumatic brain injuries. We have heard from the companies who provide the services to those people that they don't have enough funding to even hire people to provide those services. We've heard from nursing homes begging for funding for the people that they take care of, and others begging for funding to keep people out of those nursing homes. And that was a difficult and sobering thing to listen to. all of those weighty needs. And many of the stories that came before us at that committee started with a line that said, "I was doing fine until I had an automobile accident," and then went on to tell some terrible story of the loss of their independence, of the loss of their function, and the heavy price that that brought upon them and upon their families, and led them ultimately to be sitting in front of our Appropriations Committee begging for some kind of relief from the heavy burdens on their shoulders. And I hope that we made a good decision about prioritizing those needs. I don't know if we put that priority list in the right order, but I reached a conclusion that if there came a chance for me to do something that would prevent that person from sitting at the table in the first place, I would do it. And this bill is that bill, and I would ask for your support.
Thank you, Representative. Further discussion to the bill. Representative Dow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
Proceed.
Thank you. Representative, just two questions. Number one, just so I understand the context of the bill, if anybody in my car is unbuckled, I'm the driver, if anybody in my car is unbuckled, is that an offense or is it just the driver?
If there's anyone in your car that's under the age of 18 that's unbuckled, the vehicle can be stopped at this point, and you, the driver, if they're under 16, would receive the citation. If they're over 16, they would receive the citation.
Okay, and so if anybody in my car is unbuckled, I can be pulled over, and then depending on their age, there will be a citation issued to somebody.
That's correct.
Okay, my next question is, you mentioned, and the bill mentions that there is no fine if the education course is taken. What is the cost of the education course?
The education course will be provided through the Utah Department of Transportation. It'll be an online course, and at this point, from what I've been informed by UDOT, there are going to be no cost. They'll be able to go online without paying a cost, print that off, and take the certificate to have the citation waived. However, again, first offense will still be a warning at this point before that citation is ever issued.
Thank you. Representatives, I was out yesterday putting out flags. I had the opportunity to work with the Scouts, and I can tell you right now, we were in and out of my pickup quite a bit. We could have been issued a whole slew of citations, even though I never got my vehicle above 5 miles an hour while we were putting out the flags. I worry, representatives, that we're going down a road that we've had this piece of legislation in front of this body at least a half a dozen times. And every single time we've had it in front of us, we have come to the conclusion that this is not something we want to do, that we're not ready to go in this direction. And the reason is just like as was stated here, I as a driver can be cited or can be pulled over, even if somebody in the back of the car happens to want to take a nap or wants to stretch out or wants to reach down and get a drink of water or whatever and unbuckles, I can be liable for that. We need to understand that there's only so many things that we can do, only so many things we can have control of. Right now it's a secondary offense, and I think there's good reason that it's a secondary offense, and that is to avoid all of these other endless kinds of pulling over that could happen. Now, I trust the sponsor of the bill would never do that. Number one, because he's generally speaking, he's in a situation where vehicles are moving at freeway speed, and it becomes much more critical. Number two, because he's really a pretty nice guy. So he wouldn't do that. But the fact of the matter is once you open that door, we don't know who's going to walk through that. And so I would resist this effort to take what we've already considered many, many times as a secondary law to make it a primary law. Thank you.
Further discussion to the bill. Representative Ipson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I rise in support of this bill. Operate a business, operate a trucking company, and we operate under the Federal Motor Carrier Statute, and we're required by that statute, the drivers of our trucks, to buckle the seat, to have their seatbelts buckled. And I can tell you that the safety and the things that brings, and as a businessman, we talked about workers' comp, it's critical that we do all we can to bring those costs down to business. And this is one way that we can do it. I fully support this bill, and I encourage you to vote for it.
Thank you, Representative. Further discussion to the bill, Representative Jeremy Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. Will the sponsor yield to a question?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
Proceed.
Thank you. In your presentation, you mentioned that we're going to come back in a couple years and see if this bill has benefited the state like you're anticipating it will. What is that? Can you quantify what that benefit would be that you're looking for?
Yes, the benefit we'd be looking for would be an increase in people's participation in choosing to wear seatbelts. So, like I said, currently the statistics indicate we're somewhere about 83% on a statewide average, that we should see, like other states, a 10 to 12% increase in usage, which then, of course, is going to equate in a reduction in fatal car crashes, and, of course, that would equate to what we saw in Minnesota, a reduction in cost to taxpayers and to the citizens that were currently occurring.
Okay, thank you. In looking at other states that have primary seatbelt laws, I came up with just a handful: Tennessee, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Mississippi, and Wisconsin, that all have primary seatbelt laws, but their usage is nearly identical to our usage rates right now. I'm not convinced that this law will necessarily increase our usage rates to the level that we're anticipating, and so I will not be supporting the bill. Thank you.
Further discussion to the bill, Representative Ellison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I rise in support of this bill. I had the opportunity to hear this in committee, and I hope I can clear up just a couple of maybe misconceptions that exist about this. One comment that we've seen this bill before, I beg to differ. This is a completely different bill than we've seen before. The enforcement and penalty is way different than what we've addressed. It doesn't raise revenue. Another comment was made that we need more education. That's what this bill does. It gives officers an opportunity to educate citizens about why this is a good practice. In committee, one of the few people who testified against this, I asked them what their opinion of the Utah Indoor Clean Air Act was, and they said they opposed it based on personal liberties. Well, you know, that's fine for the person who wants to participate in that activity, but the cost to the other people that would have to breathe smoke is not something as a society we want to put up with. How would you feel if one of your family members is hurt or injured by a driver who, no fault of their own, lost control of their vehicle through a weather-related event or being hit from behind, and because they weren't restrained, lost control of their vehicle and impacted you? This bill is about personal liberties, and it's about our right not to be injured by people who don't take personal responsibility when operating a vehicle. There's a statement that says your right to swing your fist ends at the end of my nose. That I think is true here. And this bill, we already have the seatbelt law in our books. We're not necessarily talking about that. We're talking about the enforcement mechanism. And the enforcement mechanism here is an opportunity for an officer to help a citizen be better educated. That's what we're talking about. So again, I rise in strong support of this. I believe it's a personal liberty issue that will help protect our citizens from other people who are not as responsible in terms of buckling up when they operate their vehicle. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion to the bill, Representative Cutler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I remember years ago, I went to lunch with a bunch of guys, and as I was coming back from lunch, I was speeding and got pulled over by an officer. And he came up to me, "Did you realize you were speeding?" I thought, yeah, I drive down that all the time. I do know what the speed limit is. He looked inside the car and he saw that every person in my car had a seatbelt on. And he says, "Well, since all of you are wearing a seatbelt, I'll let you off this time." I've never forgotten that. Thought how important it is, even if we're just going to lunch with a bunch of guys, to put our seatbelts on. To me, if this law can save one life, it is well worth it. Will we know which life we save? I don't think so. But for me, it's well worth voting for this bill if we can save but only one life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative. Further discussion to the bill, Representative Sagers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. Historically, I voted against this bill. About a year ago, I thought about sponsoring the same bill. The reason for that dramatic change is quite simple. One afternoon, I'm watching TV on the Discovery Channel. They showed a cab driver driving down the street, no seatbelt on, about 7 miles an hour, hit a parked car. This guy was all over his automobile, the front seat, the back seat, everywhere. He had no control whatsoever of his body or who that body impacted. I started thinking about my grandchildren, my wife, and other people I transport in my car. I thought, how would I feel if I buckled my grandchildren, which I did up until that point. My kids were buckled in, my wife was buckled in, but I was not because I didn't have to do it. It was my right not to do it. I realized by doing that, I put them in great danger. I thought about that. I do not want to be responsible for the death of a grandchild or a child or one of my children. I'll gladly buckle up, and I've buckled up every time since. I think that's something we all need to consider. Is beyond our personal rights, to the rights of others who may affect within inside our car or outside of our car if we lose control. I had no idea how simple that was to happen. But at 7 miles an hour, this cabbie had no control whatsoever. Hit the windshield, bounced into the back seat. I had no idea how much he weighed, but if the velocity is going, it would certainly hurt somebody, if not kill him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative. Further discussion to the bill, Representative Cunningham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I'm going to stand in support of this bill. I know many of you have heard I had a sister that was killed from an automobile accident. My sister could have been that individual that, if she'd have been wearing a seatbelt, probably would be here with us today. But I know what it's like to get a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning from a brother that says that your sister's not going to live from the accident that she was just involved in. And maybe when you come from a family as large as I came from, the odds are in our favor that we're going to probably have a lot more challenges. And I support this because it could be that one life. It could be a member of your family's life. My dad also taught driver's ed for 36 years. And this was one rule that once vehicles started to have the seat belts, we all had the seat belts on. Because in those early days, way back, some vehicles didn't have the seat belts that we needed to take care of a family. But I hope each one of you look in your hearts, because I know that we talk about personal liberties, but it's also the liberties that we affect other people's lives when we don't conform to some of the things that we need to. So I stand in support of the bill, and I know my mother does, my father does, and 11 other brothers and sisters that wish we had our sister back. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Further discussion to the bill, Representative Stratton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I would like to express my appreciation for the sponsor and all the comments that have been stated here. I do rise in opposition to this bill. As we look at the things that are taking place nationally, there's no fewer, in my understanding, there's no fewer than 9 states that have a primary seatbelt law that have equal or less adherence to buckling up. Certainly, we need to make sure that we're doing all we can. I commend our state and the citizens for having a rating of 83% that do buckle up now. I recognize the intent of this bill. Remind the body that currently it is a primary offense if you're less than 19 to not be wearing a seatbelt. And I'd be glad to be corrected by the sponsor if that's not correct. I think that we would do ourselves much better by putting resources and effort behind education and not feel like we've solved the problem by passing a bill that, in my opinion, doesn't need to be passed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem.
Thank you, Representative. Further discussion to the bill, Representative Sandel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I rise in support of this bill. Let me give you maybe an added perspective, representatives. I have a 21-year-old daughter. I want to send the message to her and her friends anytime I can to buckle up. And if that's the case, for me to vote yes for this bill, I want to send that message that they will be safer. They'll be safer in their occupancy of the inside that vehicle if they do get in a crash, if all of them are buckled up. And I think that's a perspective that, as a father, that I want to portray. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Further discussion to the bill. Representative McKay.
I rise in opposition to this bill for just many of the reasons that have been stated before. It's interesting. We've all heard the phrase many, many times, those who would trade a little bit of liberty for a little bit of safety deserve neither. And what I love is each one of our colleagues who've spoken in favor of this bill says, or something to this akin, I'm usually in favor of liberty, but. I'm in favor of this, but. I'm in favor of that, but. Colleagues, it's time to get our butts out of the way of people. This great negator that is cutting back on people's liberties one by one at a time, is slowly and silently how we are giving up one of the greatest elements that exists in the American heritage. It's alarming to me that we make these self-gratifying justifications based on our own experiences. And I wonder, this self-talk that we give ourselves, that we justify our actions because of one scenario or another. You go down the list, and we did this a few years ago, and we'll do this every year. There always seems to be one bill where it comes up where we're questioned whether or not we're willing to deal with liberty or deal with safety. Our motorcycles next, they can't buckle in. They become projectiles. I've been hit by one, did serious damage to my shoulder. But I'm not interested in getting rid of motorcycles. You go down the list of all the other things that could be eliminated as a result of somebody's safety. We cannot set up enough safety bumpers to prevent people from going into or bowling a gutter ball. I ask you to please not support this bill, despite the sympathies that are well-deserved by many Utahns who have lost their lives. And we take nothing away from that, and I hope that everybody understands I don't disrespect that loss. But at the end of all things being considered, give liberty one win this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Further discussion to the bill. Representative Hawks. No. Sorry. Representative Pitcher.
I would move previous question.
Previous question has been moved. All those in favor of ending debate, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed. Motion passes. Back to you, Representative Perry, for summation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. First, I want to talk about a couple of things that were brought up here. Seatbelts do save lives. Seatbelts don't take away personal choice. Just like speed limits, just like driving while you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, just like following too close, just like choosing whether to turn your signal on. Those are all traffic laws that we as citizens, as people who drive on the road, in this privilege to drive, can choose whether we want to or not. Just like we can choose, if this law passes, we still will have the right to choose. We're not taking anybody's rights away. They still have the right to choose whether they want to text and drive, whether they want to drive impaired. We're not taking anything away from somebody by doing this. As was mentioned by my good colleague from Utah County, putting out flags. I know that if it was with an organization that I work with, they'd be quite despondent by the response that you gave there. because they have a policy that's their number one policy, is that anybody who goes and does anything with that organization wears a seatbelt. But I want to give you an example. UPS delivers over 300 packages a day, each one of their drivers. And as they go out and deliver those packages, they have a mandatory, as a company, a mandatory seatbelt policy. Yes, they're going 1-2 houses. Literally, you can watch them in your neighborhood. They will go out and they will put their seatbelt on to drive from one location to 2 houses down the road. They will literally put their seatbelt on because it's that important to them as a company that their drivers stay in control of that truck and survive if something happens to them. There are 3 basic components to saving lives and public safety. There's education, there's engineering, and there's enforcement. We as a state have done a great job with engineering. We've designed great things on our roads. We put cable median barriers out there. We put cement barriers out there. We have done great things to save lives, and we've actually seen a trend going down in our fatal car crashes in the state of Utah. We've done a fantastic job educating people. We put tons of money toward education. Our Utah Department of Transportation, our Department of Public Safety, they have done their very best at educating the public. We've hit a plateau. We are not getting more people to put their seatbelts on. This is the answer that will encourage people to take that step through this education. And the last component to safety is enforcement. We know that. We know that engineering, education, and enforcement. If you don't have those components, you fail. It's a 3-rung test. And if you don't have all 3, you can have lots of education, you can have lots of engineering, but if there's no enforcement component to this situation, people just say, well, they really don't care. One of the matters that was brought up was that young people under the age of 18 and younger, there's a primary seatbelt law, and that is true. We do have that law on the books. The problem we've encountered is, once they get away from the high school, I don't know about you, but the older I get, the harder it is for me to figure out who's 18 or who's 19. And for me as an officer, I can't just stop somebody and say, well, I thought you were really young. Now, for me, I would take that as a great compliment if I got pulled over and said, I thought you were under 18. It's probably not going to happen. And those who are over 18 take great offense to it if we do stop them and suggest that. So I just want to make sure you're clearly aware that if somebody's laying down in your back seat, an officer's not going to be able to pull you over if they're laying down in your back seat for enforcement, because the officer won't see them laying down in your back seat, and they therefore will have no probable cause to make a traffic stop on the car. It's only when they can visibly see that somebody's not wearing a seatbelt they'll be allowed to make a traffic stop in this situation. I believe that this is a good bill and a good law to put forward to our citizens to show that we care. By doing so, not only will our 18 and younger population understand that we as adults believe this is important for them, but they'll continue to do it on into adulthood. We can set the way. I believe that this bill is time for it to pass. It's time for it to go forward. It's good public policy, and I would appreciate your support.
Thank you, Representative. Voting will now be open on first substitute House Bill 149. It appears that all members present have voted. Voting is now closed. First substitute, House Bill 79, has passed this body with 42 yes votes and 32 no votes, and will be transmitted to the Senate for its consideration.